Can you all hear me okay if I'm sitting down here? I love coming here. I came here last year, I think. It's a wonderful group, which should be congratulated on the very recent victory for free speech here in Charlottesville. You can, I guess, say things that a coal corporation disapproves of in public space and not be arrested for trespassing. That's to be applauded. Let me get a little bit of a sense of where you're coming from. Raise your hand if you can think of a lie that's been told about a war. Keep your hand up if you want to tell me one, just a word or a sentence. Yeah.
Gulf of Tonkin.
Gulf of Tonkin. Anybody else?
Iraq.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction. Anybody else?
At Tillman.
At Tillman.
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor.
We are at war with Libya.
Yes.
No one said Vietnam. Oh,
So,
sorry.
so this, you know, a lot of very, very smart people were putting out this idea that there was something unique about the Iraq War. That, you know, for the first time ever, a president had told a lie about a war. And I was very glad that there was this awareness building of this lie about this war. But the more I thought about it and looked at it and read about it, there were lies everywhere I looked about all kinds of wars. There were lies about wars back for thousands of years and every war in U.S. history that I looked at. So yes, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which never happened. The Spain sinking the Maine in Havana Harbor, which there was never any evidence that Spain did. Mexico invading us when we invaded Mexico. Yes, all kinds of lies about Pearl Harbor. Lies about German subs. Come on in, sit down, there's a whole front row. Lies about German subs sinking innocent American ships unprovoked, told by Wilson and Roosevelt preceding both world wars. The babies yanked out of the incubators and left on the cold floor of the hospitals in Kuwait, as told by the daughter of the ambassador, as coached by a PR firm in Washington. You know, endless lies about every war I looked at. And so I wanted to research the topic more thoroughly and see if I couldn't find lies about every war, or if maybe there weren't some wars that didn't involve lies, or they involved lies but it was sort of tangential. The war was still good, there would just happen to be some lies around the edges. Let me ask another question. Raise your hand if you can think of a war that was justified.
Civil War.
You don't have to even shout it out, just raise your hand if you think any war anywhere has ever been justifiable.
Civil War.
Wow, yeah, I heard you, thank you. Civil War. I'm sorry?
I would say World War II.
Yeah, Civil War and World War II.
World War II, yes.
Well, either you guys don't like raising your hands or you really are my kind of crowd. Because a majority of Americans think that a number of wars have been justified and that future wars could be justified. And it's this belief that is largely driving how much money we spend every year getting ready for more wars. Let me ask another question. Raise your hand if you think the United States should spend 3 times as much money every year as the next competing nation on its military. We're more important, we're better, we're wiser. It makes sense we should spend more than other people. Who thinks we should spend 3 times the next competing nation? How about this? Who thinks we should cut military spending from where it is right now? Who doesn't? I can't tell if that's it, if that's everybody. You think we should not cut military?
We should.
You think we should? Okay. Okay, this is my crowd. I don't need to sell you on anything except that perhaps I can provide some useful information for when you are talking to others. Because, of course, the fact is that the United States spends about 7 times the next competing nation each year on its military, and just about as much as all other nations put together on its military. And the vast majority of that doesn't pay for the wars. You know, we pay all that money, and then when we have a war, we have to pay for that on top of it, as if we hadn't been putting money into a war machine. And if we had a different notion of whether wars can be justified, it seems conceivable that we would be in a stronger position to push back when we have, you know, when we have this insane sort of budget debate, right, where for the first time in history we launch hugely expensive wars, and instead of raising taxes to pay for them, we cut taxes on billionaires and millionaires at the very same time, and we destroy the economy. And then we have this debate over, well, gosh, is Social Security the problem? You know, maybe we would have a different sort of discussion if we understood that over half of every dollar of income tax and over half of every dollar of payroll tax and over half of every dollar we borrow goes into this military machine, just in case there might be a justifiable war coming around the corner. And so I wanted to go and see if I couldn't find whether anything in the past might justify the idea that there could be a good war coming down the road next month or next year. And so I looked at all of the examples that we've already mentioned of lies about wars, including the lies that are told to keep them going once they're started, which are often completely different, right? I mean, whatever's keeping Libya going now is not about the need to save everybody in the next 48 hours and have a ceasefire and arms embargo. It's about something completely different. Now, often keeping the wars going is about winning and saving face and supporting the troops and all sorts of things that were not relevant to getting the war going. And then what's told about the wars after the fact, such as that the Civil War was to end slavery, or we had to have a revolution even though Canada didn't, and we couldn't have ended slavery without a war even though it didn't effectively end slavery, and every other nation ended slavery without a war. And World War II was to save the Jews, and you know, even though you just can't find that poster with Uncle Sam saying, "I want you to save the Jews," because it didn't come up until the war was over. You know, all of the stories that are told about wars after the fact are lies too, and so you start to get a different perspective as you look through history at the wars that are happening right now. Right, at the global war on terror, which was, you know, launched in revenge for a terrorist attack, but not launched against terrorists, launched against nations, right, including Afghanistan, where the Taliban was willing to turn bin Laden over to be put on trial before and after 9/11, but we preferred a war. And Iraq, which had nothing to do with it at all, but we wanted a war there. And Libya, where of course we, you know, needed a humanitarian war, right? We had to go in there to save people by bombing them, and you know, we needed Saudi Arabia's support for that, so we told them to go and kill people in Bahrain if they would support our humanitarian mission in Libya. I mean, you start to question all of the wars when you look at all of the past wars, and there are people who will pick a particular past war, and overwhelmingly, I mean 90% of the time, it's World War II in this country that people will pick and say, well, there was a justified war, therefore there might be a justified war next week. You never know, because it might be exactly the same as World War II. And there are a couple of ways to go after that, and I do both in the book. One is to show all of the problems with World War II and all of the lies and misunderstandings about what that was. The other is to point out that that was a completely different world, right? That we now live in a world where every continent and outer space and cyberspace are dominated by the U.S. military, where we have bases in most other countries around the world, where we have 1,000 military bases in other people's countries, where we have 6 or 7 wars going at a time, where we are putting as much money into this thing as everybody else put together, and far more than anybody else in the history of the planet. And the idea that we would need to do something like World War II because some other nation is about to attack us and take us over, or whatever the lies that Roosevelt was pushing about World War II with his phony maps of Nazi plans to cut up South America and so forth, it just doesn't make any sense. And when you look at the impact that machine is having on our economy, on our civil liberties, on our representative government, on the natural environment, in terms of nuclear and other dangerous proliferation, and in terms of blowback and animosity being generated around the world, in 8 different ways it's not sustainable. It's going to kill us to keep this machine going. And so the fact that you can imagine a war that would resemble one that happened 3 generations ago in a completely different world, and say if that were magically to happen now, that would justify this whole machine, doesn't seem to hold up for me. So what I did in the book was to look at the lies that were told before, during, and after wars through history, and instead of chronicling and listing them all, which would get endless and repetitive, I picked out common themes so that you could recognize similar lies to the themes that have been used before. And so in chapter 1, for example, I look at the idea that war is needed to combat evil. And evil, I think, remains absolutely essential propaganda for war today. The demonization, the racism, the religious bigotry, the way that people of the Middle East have been depicted in this country, so that we're terrified even of locking them up in a prison in this country. We're only safe if they're in Cuba. It is a very big part of what generates support for these wars, or at least did. Of course, we now have a majority against the wars. This is another reason why I wanted to write this book. We had, arguably, when we started the war in Afghanistan and the one in Iraq, a majority of Americans saying, yes, go do it. And now, for a long time now, we've had clear majorities saying, nope, never should have done it. Right? It was a mistake. And somehow we have to get there faster, right? And we've gotten there very fast with Libya, for a number of reasons. Some particular to that case, but others encouraging. And so I wanted to see if we couldn't get there faster, and then we have to worry about how we impose our will on our so-called representative government, which was more what my first book was about, because we do have 2/3 of Americans wanting to end these wars, and nobody in Washington, D.C. remotely interested. Right? They just passed yet again, and this makes 3 out of 3 for President Obama, the biggest military budget we've seen. Depending on how you slice it, at least since World War II, the biggest military budget we've seen. And they went so far as to vote down an amendment that would have denied the Pentagon a $5 billion slush fund that allows presidents to launch wars that Congress has not appropriated any money for, which includes Libya, of course. So there's absolutely no interest out of our representatives in Washington, but can we get better than a majority? Can we get 90%? Can we get passionate commitment? Can we get activism? Can we get a majority that understands immediately, not years later after thousands of deaths? And so at the same time that you have a certain segment of the population dependent on the idea that our wars are benefiting people, right? That we're bombing women for women's rights, that we're engaged in humanitarian, philanthropic efforts for our wars, which is, it's very encouraging that we need to say those things. But at the same time, you have another segment of the U.S. population that, wants to wipe all those non-English speaking, non-Christian, dark-skinned people off the face of the earth. And without that, you would lose a huge measure of support for these wars. And so this idea that somehow there are things so evil in the world that they can only be addressed with wars has to be addressed. right? I mean, this is the very realistic, serious approach of pundits on our televisions, right? If you're serious, you'll recognize that there is evil in the world, right? To propose that we not have wars anymore is just fantasy. I mean, we have a president who told us this in a Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, right? I mean, the first one on record that more or less denounced peace. If you're serious, if you're realistic, then you have to understand that we might need wars. Why? Because there are evil things in the world. Well, of course there are. War's the most evil one. You know, there's nothing worse than war that you can substitute war for. And so that remains a huge part of the argument because it's very effective propaganda. It's very emotional. It drives people's energy. The second sort of theme that I look at is the idea that wars are defensive. Right, and this is the long-standing traditional argument to legalize and legitimize wars. It's the idea that they're fought in defense, right? North Korea attacked South Korea, even though it looks like it was actually the other way around, and therefore the United States needs to have a war thousands of miles away. Or Mexico attacked us when, of course, actually we attacked Mexico, so we have to have a war. Or there's an impoverished nation halfway around the globe that's never attacked us, but we can pretend that they had something to do with 9/11, and so we'll fight a defensive war against them. Right? All of our wars are defensive. Almost all wars are defensive from almost all sides, according to the propaganda. Right? I mean, we were told by this White House that we were going into Libya to defend the reputation of the United Nations, right, the same institution that we routinely trash, and to defend regional stability, right? I mean, raise your hand if you think the United States is in the same region as Libya. But presumably we are NATO, and NATO is Europe, and Europe is in the same region as Libya, or something. But it's always somehow defensive, right? Nobody says we're going to have an aggressive war. Nobody, ever. So that has to be addressed, right? Because if we were to actually have a defensive war, right, if we were actually attacked, everybody would know it. There would be no need for any argument whatsoever, right? But it's all the arguments about how the wars are defensive that we have to start analyzing and seeing through. And if you look at all the past ones, you start to recognize the themes in the new ones. The newer and growing argument for wars that I look at in another chapter of the book is that they're fought out of generosity, right? Out of the goodness of our hearts. And you know, one way of refuting this idea is to look at the actual motivations of the players involved, right? Because you know, you could come up with a scenario where you thought that there was actually a case for militarized generosity, right? If you actually believed that in Libya or anywhere else, there were people under immediate threat of mass slaughter, and the only way to prevent it was with military force that would be used on a temporary basis, and then you would negotiate a settlement, and you would figure out trade-offs and educate and pacify and build up the society, and you wouldn't have to have an endless war or foreign occupation, but you would have to use military. I mean, you can imagine such a scenario. But if you look at the motivations of the people who make the arguments for wars of generosity, that's not how these people operate, right? I mean, we were funding and arming Gaddafi up until a couple weeks before he was Adolf Hitler, and we were arming his opposition, right? We're currently supporting and arming dictators in other countries all around that region of the world and elsewhere on Earth. I mean, if we wanted to, you know, to intervene out of the goodness of our hearts, we would start by unintervening in dozens of countries. I mean, we're already intervened everywhere. I mean, the best we ever do is switch sides. And so if you look at our conduct in Bahrain or in Yemen or in Iraq or Afghanistan for that matter, you know, it's clear that what's motivating the Pentagon and the White House and therefore the Congress, is not humanitarian intervention. There are too many humanitarian crises around the world that are simply ignored, where there are not the interests that actually motivate these people. The other way to look at it is to ask whether such violent intervention can actually do anybody any good. Because if we were to stop propping up the dictators and arming them, if we were to start peacefully intervening in civil societies around the globe with non-violent aid, most of our foreign aid is weapons. If we were to make our foreign aid non-weapons, if we were to aid people with resources and guidance and education and civil society tools, would it not do better? The evidence suggests as much. If you look at studies of resistance efforts to tyrannical abuses in the world over the past century, non-violent movements have been over twice as effective as violent ones. And that's even just in terms of immediate impact. I mean, nowhere have we, the United States, violently nation-built a nation that lasted as a democracy. I mean, we haven't done it. It doesn't work. And so when you come in out of the goodness of your heart and violently intervene on the part of one part of a nation in a civil war against the other part, you're going to have increased violence and blowback for decades to come. And so that has to be factored in to the calculation while we're fantasizing about good wars. Then I also, of course, in the book look at the arguments for keeping the wars going. We're fighting them for the benefit of the troops who are taking part in them, which is absolute disgusting nonsense from people who have absolutely no respect for the troops or the contracts that they've signed, who are held over beyond their contracts, who are lied to, who, if they're polled, often want the wars ended. But that's the argument we're fed. And the other most common one, of course, is we're about to win. We're just about to win. Progress is right around the corner, but it's fragile and reversible. But it's right around the corner. I mean, we've been given this for a decade, monthly in Afghanistan. I mean, the biggest lie is about what the wars consist of and whether they are making things better or worse, right? Because it's our wars, it's our drone strikes that are driving the resistance to our occupations and the hostility towards our nation and the terrorist attacks. And we use this cycle, we use the reactions to our wars as justifications for the wars, and then as we accomplish some military objective, we declare that there's progress and things are getting better and we're about to succeed, and then we'll be able to pull out, or more often, then we'll have to stay longer. But in either case, there's progress right around the corner, which in the case of Afghanistan has been demonstrably, empirically false for several years now, widely understood, and yet they just keep saying it and doing it. So if you look at enough of this stuff, you start to think, well, maybe we don't have to have wars. This would be a different idea. We just don't have them anymore. When you talk about other horrible things we've invented, like rape or slavery, people don't start raising questions about, just rapes and good cases of slavery and how it's in our genes and we can't get rid of it if we try, and can't you be realistic and have regulations to make it more humane, and so no, we say get rid of those things, right? And war, as indisputably the worst thing we've ever created, why don't we get rid of that one? And the common response is, well, you can't. It's in our genes. It's inevitable. It's just there. You have to learn to deal with it. And this, the evidence, such as there is, as if it were required, goes exactly the opposite direction, right? War is a relatively new invention, right? For most of human history and prehistory, there was no such thing, right? I mean, as hunter-gatherers, we did not have wars, and most of our prehistory is as hunter-gatherers. And as sedentary, complex societies, war has been very sporadic, right? I mean, there are people who will try to argue that there has always been a war somewhere. If you let me continue, we're going to do lots of questions and answers, and you can be first. But people will tell you there's always been a war somewhere on planet Earth. There's always been a war, for the past 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 years, But they will completely ignore the fact that there has also always not been a war a million other places on planet Earth at the very same time. Most places at most times do not have wars. There are societies that have eliminated war. There are cultures that didn't have war until introduced by ours. Australia didn't have wars till the white folks came. Our own Southwest didn't have wars. War is something that can come and go. There are nations that have banned weapons, that have banned wars, that have done away with it, that have limited it. During our own Cold War with the Soviet Union, we routinely chose to avoid war. Right? We had incidents. You might remember the story of George W. Bush wanting to fly U-2 planes low over Iraq, painted with UN colors, and get them shot at, and that could be a cool way to start a war with Iraq at the same time that he was telling everybody that war would be the last resort and so forth. Well, when we had a U-2 plane actually shot down with the Soviet Union, we chose to avoid a war. You can pick out identical incidents to ones that are used to justify wars and line them up with cases where we chose to avoid wars. It's perfectly humanly possible. We didn't have different genes on that day, right? So if we can limit wars, if we can avoid wars sometimes, why not every time, right? If we can go through almost all prehistory and history with wars being a male thing, almost entirely a male thing, and now we have women doing it. If women could start doing it, why can't men stop doing it? Well, of course they can. Of course they can. And so this is the argument of where we ought to get, and then how do we get there? And part of what has to be dealt with is the idea of what wars are. That wars, regrettable as they might be, are nonetheless glorious and heroic, and they're becoming very clean and precision and smart bombs and so forth. The images that we have of wars, the language we use, battlefields, and there are no more battlefields. Our wars are fought in towns and cities. They're just other people's towns and cities. Our wars kill almost entirely civilians. Our wars kill almost entirely non-Americans. Our wars do more environmental damage than anything else. Our wars leave death behind for decades, if not centuries, if not millennia to come. Right? The children in Tripoli playing with cluster bombs, for days and then having their arms blown off are casualties of war of a type that will continue, just as the casualties from the depleted uranium in Libya or Iraq or Yugoslavia. Wars are completely horrific, disgusting things that are not in the least bit glorious. And there is all kinds of courage and solidarity and sacrifice that goes into wars that can go just as well into other projects. And wars traumatize even the modern desktop warriors. I mean, the people who are sitting at desks flying drones from thousands of miles away, in some cases, are going home and killing themselves. Wars push more wars and more violence of all forms into all of our societies. The other point that you have to get to when looking at all of the lies that are told about wars is then what actually motivates them? And the actual motivations, of course, are not very deeply hidden. You don't need to speculate or to create grand theories to be investigated. Mr. Murdoch, can not only fall asleep and get pies thrown in his face. He also has been open for the past 8 or 9 years from before these wars started about what they were for. He wanted a war in Iraq for the oil. And every editor and every pundit in his employment around the globe miraculously shared that opinion. These were going to be great, glorious wars. And the wars are driven by the incredibly profitable machine. Right? We had a CEO of a weapons company in this country tell PBS a month or two ago that if we did scale back in Afghanistan, he really, really hoped we could occupy Libya, because this is how they make money. And the money is increasingly privatized. You know, we have 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. We also have 100,000 private contractors in Afghanistan, 200,000 people, not all Americans, some of them, you know, from third countries being paid poverty wages and treated like dirt, but we have the profits from those private contracts going into a small number of hands that are funneling an increasing little crumb into election campaigns. Wars are driven by the war machine that spends its time drawing up plans and scenarios for possible wars. We don't have any department in Washington drawing up extensive plans and scenarios for every possible way to peace. We have that for war. We have all of that planning and momentum for war. We have desires for territory, for bases, for weapons positioning, for use of resources, for denial of resources to other nations, for power, for the electoral calculations of often bad but always Machiavellian political strategists. You know, we have motivations for war that are not very deeply hidden. You know, that they will tell you quite openly that they need to have a gas pipeline through Afghanistan. You don't need to speculate about it. The propaganda that drives these wars has become, since President Wilson, since World War I, incredibly professional, very, very well thought out, scientifically planned. I mean, this science of manipulating people's emotions has been developed to an incredible degree, and it's not switched on and off. It's constant. It's steady. It doesn't come for World War I and then stop again for the 20s and the 30s, where you have this incredible pushback against wars. It's just there steadily. The Libyan rebels, this handful of heroic grassroots heroes led by a guy who mysteriously spent 20 years with no visible means of support living a couple of miles from the CIA in Northern Virginia, they have hired, at no cost, the biggest PR firm in Washington, D.C. And they've promised to pay them when they're rich. The government of Libya tried to hire me to do their lobbying. You know, a guy who works from his house in Charlottesville. I mean, this tells you who is going to control the message about a war. The other thing to stress, I think, is that we're sort of losing the conception that wars are actually not legal. Wars are crimes. And so we have these debates over whether it's moral to have this new war or not, which we wouldn't have if we were attacked. If we were attacked, or we were actually honestly about to be attacked, we would just have a war. There would be no debate about it. Or we would have a response that was wiser and less violent, but we would react without the marketing campaign. If we understood that wars are not legal, and we understood that laws should be followed, and we had law enforcement, much of these debates would just go away. In 1928, every nation on Earth, organized by a Republican Secretary of State of the United States, banned all wars in something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is still a treaty, which under Article 6 of our Constitution is still the supreme law of the land. I mean, if we can drag up footnotes from a Supreme Court ruling 100 years ago in order to rule that that corporations are going to be citizens, we can certainly drag up a treaty that's been forgotten that was actually ratified by the United States Senate and is the law of the land. Or we can just go back as far as the UN Charter. or we can look at our own Constitution and the War Powers Resolution and our own laws on what's legal and not legal in terms of starting wars, and look at the tradition in which, with hypocrisy, but also with a great deal of good rhetoric and good precedent, our country made wars illegal and prosecuted war criminals after World War II. We are now reversing that. In 1973, the War Powers Resolution said, we're going to add some specifics to what's in the Constitution, which to my mind weakened the Constitution, but it added some specifics. They said wars or hostilities, military actions other than wars or hostilities. If we are attacked, the president can respond with a war or hostilities, but must report what's going on in all sorts of detail within 48 hours, must get our authorization or our declaration within 60 days, and must complete it in 90 days if he doesn't. This was, a very clear law put on the books. We are now told by Harold Coe, who is the new John Yoo. John Yoo was the guy who would legalize anything Bush felt like doing. Harold Coe is the guy who will, quote-unquote, legalize anything Obama feels like doing. Harold Coe says, well, it's not hostilities, so it doesn't apply. It doesn't apply because Libya didn't attack us, but if it did apply, to argue that it's not hostilities to bomb people's houses is to declare that the law is going to be whatever we feel like the law being that day, and nothing else. You had senators from both parties, not Vietnam War protester Senator Kerry, who also thinks it's not hostilities to bomb people's houses, but you had senators from both parties asking Mr. Coe, well, what in the world does this mean? Can we drop nuclear bombs on Tripoli and it won't be hostilities because we don't have U.S. troops on the ground? And so he had to back off a little bit and say, well, some level of killing people would be hostilities, but we haven't figured out exactly what level that is, but this isn't it. It's absolute lawlessness. And the International Criminal Court is being turned into, rather than a tool to be used against war, which is what it was supposed to be, a tool of war. Right? When the United States can get the international court to break all land speed records in indicting Gaddafi, when his court has yet to indict a non-African, when it has yet to indict an American for war crimes, and then Libya responds by indicting the Secretary General of NATO. That's a little bit different thing. When the United States prosecutes Charles Taylor, or when Spain prosecutes U.S. officials, or Italy prosecutes CIA agents. This is one country enforcing universal standards on another country. But when you have a so-called international body, the International Criminal Court, working for one particular nation against other nations, you are damaging the idea of international law. You're destroying it. It's almost worse than nothing. I just want to mention a couple of things before taking questions. One is that the military-industrial complex, which Mr. Whitehead had a wonderful article about recently, is 50 years old, dating from when President Eisenhower mentioned the military-industrial complex, and we're going to have a big conference about that with a lot of great speakers here in Charlottesville, September 16th to 18th. So if you are around, you're invited, and if you can remember this website address, you can get all the information and register to come. mic@50cville.org. micat50cville.org. Or you can go to my website, davidswanson.org, and ask me, and I'll remind you what it was. The other thing is that in many of the countries that I've mentioned, because we're bombing them, or that are part of the Arab Spring, or that have their own troubles around the world, people tend to stand for a lot less than we've been standing for. I mean, we do have people like who are willing to get arrested speaking against the practices of coal corporations, and that's great. But for the most part, in comparison to other countries, we sit back and take it, right? I mean, we have overwhelming majorities in this country who want to end wars, cut the military, tax billionaires, all sorts of things that are just completely off the radar screen in Washington. Well, we're taking the example of Tunisia and Egypt and Greece and Spain and Madison, Wisconsin for that matter, and we're going to Washington in October, not to have a march or a rally, but to occupy the place and shut down the buildings and stay. And if you'd like to learn more about that and come, try to remember this one, October2011.org, October2011.org. And I know I'm already abusing your patience, but before we take questions, I want to read just a short poem that I really, really like, that I think has for a century done a very good job of describing war in a few words better than, you know, hundreds of hours of television viewing or newspaper reading. I should perhaps say that this is from someone who died in World War I, whose name was Wilfred Owen, and that the poem's in English, but the last two lines are in Latin. And the Latin, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, means it is sweet and good to die for your country. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas! Gas, quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim, through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Thank you. Did you still have a question?
I'll wait, go ahead.
Okay. Right here?
Yeah. How long do you think our tolerance would last if we reinstituted the draft? First of all. And secondly, there's been a lot of talk recently about what Eisenhower, said or believed. Why isn't that given more credence?
The first point, the draft, I mean, the first important thing to understand is there's not a snowball's chance in hell that we're going to have one. They will do absolutely anything to avoid it. I mean, they are considering even improving our schools so that people aren't too stupid to get in the military. They're also, Obama's transferring this troops to teachers thing to the Pentagon from the Department of Education. They're letting people teach with lower qualifications as long as they participated in the wars, and as well as defunding the schools massively in general. The draft that we have now is a poverty draft. I mean, it's very, very disproportionately poor neighborhoods that the kids go into the military, and it's by no means exclusively, but largely because there aren't other choices for what to do. And whenever the economy does badly, the recruiters do well. we already spend more recruiting each person we recruit than we spend educating a person. You know, these are our priorities, and we have significantly lowered the standards in terms of, you know, physical capacity, age, scholastic achievement. I mean, they're taking anybody they can take into the military, investing millions and millions into recruiting them, and then having them sign contracts that don't mean a thing, so that people are stop lost. You know, you do your duty and then you're held over and do some more. It is much easier to keep somebody than to get somebody new. We also have privatized over half of the military, so that we just go to other companies, and many of the people, whether they're mercenaries or cooks or laundry or whatever, are not Americans. They're hired from countries where people are desperate for any job. And we are very rapidly now unmanning the military. We're going to have unmanned wars with robots, with drones. You know, if you think Americans didn't mind killing masses of people when American deaths were 2, 3, 4% of the total, just imagine when they're zero. Right? So they will do anything to avoid a draft, and they are unlikely to need a draft. I mean, not impossible, just unlikely. I mean, if they attack Iran and things go from worse to even worse, you know, but I think, you know, if we had a draft, of course, and if we had a fair draft that was equally applied, which is a whole different question, then of course there would be more resistance. But we shouldn't jump from that to Americans are completely heartless, right? I mean, it's the fact that Americans do care about other people is why the wars have to be sold as philanthropy and humanitarian endeavors, right? I mean, you can't just say we're going to go kill a bunch of people we don't like who aren't American and sell a war anymore. You know, Americans do care. They just don't care enough or have the time or the energy or the organization to take effective action to change things. And some of the reasons why that's the case are the same reasons why, you know, Eisenhower's wisdom is neglected. We have two big political parties, and both of them like wars. We have, you know, in this debate on the budget, you have both political parties' leadership lined up pretty close together, and the American public way over here. You have the think tankers from the right who want to talk about, you know, the health care costs and Social Security. You have the ones in the middle who want to talk about the recession, and there's no revenue when you have a recession. And you have the ones on the left who want to talk about the Bush tax cuts, which of course ought to be called the Bush-Obama tax cuts at this point, but you don't have any communication system, you don't have any institution, you don't have any well-funded organization that wants to talk about the fact that half our money goes to the military and the wars, and that there's a military machine driving that Eisenhower warned of. And you don't have any big media institution owned by Murdoch or anyone else that isn't profiting from the war machine. It doesn't, in many cases, have overlapping board membership, and not to mention, you know, corporate family ownership of parts of the war machine. So, I mean, all the systemic reasons that our representative republic is weak are the reasons why we don't have a sensible approach to the military. I mean, Americans, if you look at the polls and surveys, want to cut the military. Washington doesn't. Yes, way in the back.
Yes, maybe simplistic, but the simple solution would seem to me to be to simply cut off the source of funds by not paying taxes. If more than 50% of my tax dollar is going to fund wars that I don't believe in, that I think are offensive rather than defensive, and it's bothered me for years that my tax dollars are going to support something that I absolutely abhor, or that I think are illegal. And if, in fact, 2/3 of the population agree with that, if there were somebody who had the power to rally people around that point and en masse, people could do a tax revolt. You cannot jail everybody, but, you know, if people could say, we absolutely refuse, we passively resist supporting this war by not putting more money toward it in that way, and refuse to pay taxes until you stop funding this war movement. The other I had a question for you though, about the legality and recourse that a citizen has, because, you know, I'm very defeatist at this point. I don't think the citizens have any recourse anymore, except unless they band together, and that kind of movement and that great a level, on that grand a scale, countrywide, in tax revolt. I think that's about the only thing that could actually make a change at this point. I just think that the corporations control everything, the dollar is what's running everything, but that's, anyway, but,
Why don't I speak to those ideas and then we'll come back to you. I think it's, I completely agree with where you're coming from, and it's absolutely indisputable that if everybody stopped paying their taxes, the war machine would be shaken to its foundations. The reason, as I'm sure you understand, that it is simplistic is that you can't get tens of millions of people to all do the same thing in the same moment, no matter what it is. It's very, very difficult. Somebody has to lead, others have to be inspired, others have to be cajoled and organized, and it has to be made very, very easy and fun for them. I mean, if you could get maybe 20% of the country to stop paying taxes and to announce we're not paying taxes because of the wars, because of course they're just gonna, take the money from Social Security and pay for the wars. I mean, they're not gonna put the money where you say not to put it, But I mean, I completely applaud the relatively small number of people that are doing this, and I encourage wonderful groups like the War Resisters League and all sorts of people who are doing it. But if you were to get, say, 20% of the country to do it, it would have a huge impact. I don't know how you get there. If you were to get 1% of the country to do what everybody does in civilized nations across the globe for the past century and go and nonviolently shut down Washington, D.C., it would have an even bigger impact. 1% of the country. And that's much less risk. I mean, I appreciated all of it, and the people introduce you and they talk about what courage it takes to get arrested. It doesn't take a bit of courage to get arrested. There's nothing traumatic about it. It's absolutely enjoyable. You do it with your friends. I mean, you do it to have an impact. So be quiet about it's enjoyable bit. But it is. And if you go with thousands and thousands of other people, they can't arrest you. Just as you said, if everybody doesn't pay their taxes, they can't arrest everybody. Well, if enough of us go to Washington, D.C., and I've been parts of groups that were big enough to do this before, they won't arrest you because they don't have the jails to do it. And so, if we could get 1% of the country to join something like October2011.org, we could have the same impact. It may seem more roundabout and complicated than not paying our taxes, which seems simple and easy, but it's the trick is getting everybody to do it at once. Yes. And
there is a group of people, in fact, that are taking this tax thing to task. You can read about it at Infowars.com. And they tell a lot of information about people who have just stopped and refused to pay income tax because they can't prove that there's a law that says you have to. It was never really ratified. They've gone to and done live taped interviews. They caught these people at the very top who had no answers, who could not prove that we're supposed to pay income taxes. More and more people are not paying income taxes, and several of them have not paid for 8 or 10 years and are still free on the streets. Some of them are getting arrested, of course, but if it's publicized enough, You're leaving people alone. So read more about it, Infowars.com.
Well, it's good for people to act on their convictions and to take risks. It's just something that in that case has not yet affected public policy. It hasn't eliminated the income tax, and it hasn't shifted where the money gets spent or from who the money gets taken. Yes, right here, and then
Would you comment on the three giant idols that again makes for war? God or religion, which is innate in our culture. The worship of guns and nationalism. The flag has become an idol.
yeah, you're absolutely right that I should have said more about those to begin with. They're a big part of the first chapter in the book, which is about evil, about demonizing foreign groups, and differences of religion as well as race and culture are a huge part of that. You know, I mean, a lot of wars in the past have been fought in the name of religion, right? We're going to convert them to save their souls or kill them, whichever comes first. And you know, when President McKinley said, you know, we had to take care of the poor, stupid Filipinos because we were Christians. They were our little brown brothers. We had to, you know, never mind they had universities older than ours, and they were a lot of them were Catholic and so forth. But you know, it's part of the propaganda. Nowadays, it's less openly. I mean, it's very prevalent within the U.S. military, but in terms of political rhetoric, it's less openly. You know, this war is to go impose our religion on the heathens. It's more subtle in that you demonize another religion and you associate that other religion with the place that you're bombing or occupying. So, you know, just as we would never stand for some other nation occupying ours, right? We occupy Muslim nations for their own good. Whether they want it or not, it's for their own good we're going to occupy them. It would be hasty and reckless and immoral for us to leave too soon. They're depending on us. And a lot of that is facilitated by the demonizing of people's skin, language, culture, religion, etc. And if your religion tells you that this is what you're supposed to be doing, you know, then you have, you know, a mandate from God, which is, you know, of course, our recent president, George W. Bush, told people he had, you know, that God had advised him to launch these wars. Then you have a really powerful argument with some people. Yes, guns.
Worship of guns.
Guns and
You know, the fanatical, the NRA. You know, everyone should have a gun.
they are, and it's all connected. You know, throughout our society, the same patterns of thought impact policies of different sorts, right? So, you know, we're bombing the nation of Afghanistan to punish some terrorists who passed through there and trained there, but also trained in Europe and trained at our airports and so forth, and then died crashing airplanes into our buildings. Just as, you know, we punish whole populations in a prison in this country when one guy does something wrong, or we arrest anybody who looks like they might be Mexican in certain states now because somebody might be an illegal immigrant. You know, we don't see the injustice from the side of the people we're imposing it on because we've manipulated our conception of them so that they aren't exactly people. You know, they're something else. And with policies of guns and weapons, the way we think about the military machinery is the same way we think about the handguns. You know, and we have incredible laws to allow people have handguns, to allow people to have all kinds of guns.
Take it to church.
Who, yeah, you can have guns in church, you can have guns in bars, what could go wrong? And we permit people and groups to, to have weapons that we, no longer permit all kinds of other rights, because we're terrified of them. And of course, nationalism is the newest, well, the strongest and a relatively new way of manipulating people's emotions for wars. I mean, wars used to be fought by the wealthy 500 years ago, and they were fought for personal glory, and now they're fought by the poor, and they're fought for national glory, and they're fought for a flag, and the flag will get people to go to wars and to kill and to risk dying in wars. I mean, when you go back to the Civil War, nationalism didn't cut it, right? I mean, let's, for the sake of our nation, let's have this war. Wasn't doing it. You had to make it about slavery. You had to make, in the middle of the war, you had to come back with a different argument and say, no, there really is a good reason for this insanity. Because nationalism just wasn't what it is now. Nationalism has been blown into something that, most people who've ever lived on Earth would never have recognized. It's a new and insane sort of phenomenon where where you identify with something that doesn't really identify with you. To my mind, it really needs to be tackled, and we don't need to campaigning around the idea that peace is patriotic ain't gonna work. Patriotism is dangerous, is what's going to work.
This is the first time I've ever been to one of these talks, and there seems to be like a think in the room that I'm not familiar with. But what I'm feeling is that there are a lot of arguments are being reduced so quickly. And so, for instance, yes, I would agree I don't want my taxes to go to war things, but if I'm going to completely rebel against taxes, well, I do want schools, I do want roads, I want hospitals, I want programs for children, I want libraries, I want parks. Okay, so these things are tangled up together, and if I, rebel, or say I'm not going to go to one, how can I disentangle it from the things that I do believe in? So I feel that argument has been completely reduced. And when you say that war is a new concept, I would have to respectfully disagree. I mean, I taught ancient Mesopotamia alongside ancient Egypt, and it goes all the way back. And no, it doesn't look like the machinery of today, but in terms of the brutality that was possible, whether it's rape, pillage, burning things down, torture, no, it was the same thing. And people go up over a hill. Mesopotamia was being flattened all the time because it was flat. Egypt was protected for almost 3,000 years because it had the Mediterranean to the north and cataracts to the south and two deserts, and it became very peaceful, but it was geographic. And these are just certain things that are being bantered about that I feel like I'm supposed to just take or accept, and I'm not really accepting. As for, but the question I would put out there that I am genuinely curious, because you've done a lot of research and you've been an activist, through your research and your observations over maybe even just 50 or 60 years, if people have been successful in doing something to bring more peace than more war, and if I were willing to give my energy to that, like one of your ideas, and I'm open to that possibility, is surrounding the Capitol, trying to get to shut down and make an impact, where can we possibly make an impact?
So, you are not supposed to sit there and accept anything and agree to believe something you're told. You're supposed to do the exact opposite. You're supposed to do exactly what you're doing. You're supposed to question everything. I think I may have been rather unclear in my hasty summary of the idea that war is something new. If modern Homo sapiens have been around for tens of thousands, 80,000, 90,000 years, right, then something that has only been around for 10,000 years at the most, 12,000 years at the absolute most, is relatively new, right? And so when people go back and they find the bones of ancient, prehistoric humans, and they say, oh, look at all the injuries from war. And then we discover, well, no, actually, those are the marks of the teeth of the large cats that used to eat us for dinner. The anthropologists start to come up with a different, man the killer, man the warrior, the caveman who goes to war. It is something imposed by 1950s United States academics on the vast majority of human existence, which did not have war, right? The walls of Jericho, we say, oh, well, look, those were great for war, and they were actually built for floods, right? I mean, we see war everywhere, and we see it in prehistory, and we see it in ancient history, and of course it was in ancient history, and it was in Egypt, and it was in all kinds of places, but it wasn't in lots of other places where we try to see it. And so for virtually all of the history of our species, we were small groups of hunter-gatherers who did not have war. Which came first, war or the weapons? Is this chicken and egg question? The answer is the weapons, right? I mean, the weapons came for fighting large animals. The large animals were killed off. The class of people who didn't work for a living, who didn't produce food, that had to have these fancy weapons, needed something to do, and they needed to start attacking each other. And when we came to have towns and cities, when there was, when agriculture happened, some cultures had war and some didn't. And the ones that did certainly did, and there's no purpose in denying it. And so I did not mean to give the impression that war had just been thought up this week or this century or this millennium, but that in the broad perspective, in countering the notion that war is in our genes, no, war is new. The idea of not paying taxes entirely in order to not pay taxes on wars, I'm with you. I want to pay taxes, and I want to pay them for all of the things that I want the government to do. There is a segment of the population that doesn't want to pay any taxes for anything, doesn't even want to have a government, and that may be disproportionately represented in this room, but it's not me. What has been done and what can you do? My other book, Daybreak, is entirely about that. This book is in part about that, but much has been done. If you look at Europe, the source of our worst wars ever, I mean the source of the very worst things that have ever occurred to humanity or the planet, the idea of war breaking out in Europe is just unimaginable now. I mean, just as the idea of war breaking out between Virginia and Maryland. I mean, there have been unifications of sections of humanity that make it impossible. And you can't easily say, well, let's just add the rest of the world, of course, because you're talking about parts of the world that are exploiting the rest of the world. But you have seen all kinds of progress, and you have seen bans on weapons and bans on unusual atrocities and limitations on war. You have most modern wealthy nations and most poor nations have not engaged in war and don't want to. The United States has to bribe countries kicking and screaming to be parts of its coalitions of the willing, to be bit players in wars against completely impoverished, disarmed nations halfway around the world. If everybody was hungry for war, they would jump at the chance to be part of that.
How do you explain the former Yugoslavia? I mean, that was the 90s, and that they had the worst atrocities. I lived in Serbia for a year, and I've lived in Egypt for 2 years. And in Serbia, they had Srebrenica in 1995, where it was 8,000 men and boys were killed and put in a mass grave. It was the worst atrocity outside of World War II. And, I mean, I would like to believe this, honest to God. But, and do I think Americans in the industrial complex, and people have a lot to gain, both power and money, they put their stick in the hornet's nest? Absolutely, have no doubt about that. But, unfortunately, we have things like from 1991 to 1999 in Europe, where they just before, I think it was the 1990 or give or take, Olympics were there in Sarajevo. That had been like the place of peace.
Okay, well, let me speak to that very briefly, and then there's lots of other
Okay.
hands being raised, and then we'll come back to you.
No,
But,
that's fine. I've used up my time.
But I was, I'm not being very clear at all. I meant Western Europe, I meant the European Union, I meant the unification of Europe that has made the idea of wars breaking out between its members very unlikely. Yes, horrendous things happen everywhere, including in Yugoslavia. I think it's only by a certain measure that something that kills 8,000 people is the worst thing. You know, we just killed 1.3 million Iraqis, but I think that...
I meant like in a day. It happened in a day.
Okay. Okay, we're going to take everybody else's questions, and we'll come back for more. People who have not asked questions yet, so.
You made a lot of moral and ethical arguments against waging war, and I'm with you on that. But as a practical matter, can you respond to the argument that keeping a technologically advanced, robust military, economic drain aside, whether or not we use it, deters other nations from engaging in warlike or, you know, genocidal activity?
Well, what if we had a military that designed its weapons for defense? I mean, just about everything that our military builds is for offense, right? Is for attacking other countries. What if we designed a military for defense and we made it twice as large as the next biggest military on Earth? Would that be less of a deterrent than going and launching wars and stationing bases and provoking everybody around the world with a military that's 7 times the next competing nation? I mean, there has to be a point where even if you think your military is deterring people from attacking you, you can't get any more deterrence by making it even bigger, right? I mean, no nation is about to attack the United States. It would be absolute suicide, right? And if our military were half the size it is today, that would still be absolutely true, right? And if you want to look at, you know, non-nation actors, at terrorist groups that might attack buildings in the United States, how in the world does having the world's biggest military deter that? It can't even prevent it in any way. And so I think, aside from the fact that, you know, we can't just dismiss the matter that it's destroying our economy, that it's destroying our environment, that it's destroying our civil liberties and so forth. I mean, I don't think these are points that can be set aside.
Just quick, I meant more in terms of intervening in other countries, like the use of our military to stop things like genocide that are occurring in other countries. Like defensive weapons aren't gonna, it's not gonna help.
Well, if we didn't want genocide in other countries, we would have a very different approach to the world, right? We would be supporting sustainability and prosperity in other countries. We would be supporting the rule of law. We would be building democracy. I mean, American academics who advised activists in Cairo, Egypt, on how to approach their government did far more good at virtually no cost compared to what our military has done for the past decade in Afghanistan and Iraq at incredible cost just in economic terms. I mean, the best tools for preventing genocides just can't be found in the Pentagon. Just as the best tools for helping people after tsunamis and earthquakes, you know, can't be found in the Pentagon. You know, we have to come up with something other than the military instead of trying to retool the military as a humanitarian operation. You know, you can imagine such a scenario where you would want the military, even the military of a single nation, to go intervene in some other nation for the immediate rescue of some group. But you know, we've never had that kind of situation, and we've never had a nation, ours or any others, with a military that was used with those motivations. And so, you know, it's just not a scenario that should be driving our thinking when we decide where to put, you know, 50-some% of our public resources. There are people who haven't asked questions yet? Okay, well let's take these few questions from people who have. So here and here and here, and then.
Thanks. Just wanted a clarification on that point about tax revolt or revolution by tax protest. Not at all that I don't want to support schools, hospitals, roads. I'm with you on that, and I didn't want anyone to take it the other way. It's just a mechanism, a negotiating tactic of the entire nation where those who are against the wars could take that stand and rally around that point, that hopefully it didn't even come to that, but as a mechanism. Just wanted to clarify that. As far as using defense or offense, military, to protect other countries against genocide, it first of all assumes that our motives are genuine in going in and helping others, and that the genocide has in fact occurred in the way that it's been reported to us. There's a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman that might be interesting reading for some who aren't aware of that. Our CIA and other NSA covert operators go in and often commit actions that appear to be acts of terrorism to give us a justification for going in and being the policemen of the world. And I personally don't want my tax dollars used to police the world. I don't think that's what my tax dollars are for. And I'd just like to say that I don't think that's really a legitimate use of our Defense Department and my tax dollars.
Okay, thank you.
And the other thing, the only other question was, the guy who wrote the book, The Prosecution of George Bush for Murder, Ray, who was the prosecutor in the
Vincent
Manson trial?
Bugliosi.
Right, Bugliosi. Whatever happened, and do we have a legal case against George Bush for illegally committing us to this war and driving us into a bankrupt economy?
Nothing's happened, and yes, of course we do.
Can we sue?
Not particularly effectively, no. The best prospect for any sort of prosecution of the previous gang of war criminals is still in Spain, despite incredible diplomatic pressure from the Obama White House that has blocked some of those avenues. There is still an appeal underway in one case that would prosecute 6 second-string Bush-Cheney officials. There was, back in the back, did you have a question?
Yeah, this thing about military and guns, and we shouldn't have guns and all. I played professional music for years. I traveled through socialist, communist countries for 17 years. I know what socialism and communism is, and I know how it gets a hold is because people don't have guns. All the experts agree that gun control works. Hitler will tell you gun control works. Pol Pot will tell you that. Mao Zedong, Castro, even Gaddafi, they'll all tell you that gun control works. Because that's how they oppress their people and hold them down. Because when I've seen these people in Yugoslavia, for instance, and Americans would stand back and say, well, if you don't like your government, why don't you rebel against it? Well, what are you going to do, throw sticks at tanks? So I disagree with these people that say that we shouldn't have guns. I think that they're a necessary part. I think that in many countries, if they'd have had guns, that they would not have necessarily been overthrown, but they would have been able to defend themselves. That's all I have to say on that.
Well, I don't know. how long a speech to give you all, but I completely disagree, and I think the record is overwhelmingly in the other direction, and that nonviolent overthrows of dictators have been increasingly more effective and have been dramatically more effective and longer lasting than violent ones, and that whatever it is that's eating away our civil liberties and our representation in our government in this country right now, it ain't the lack of guns. Okay, here and then there, and then maybe we'll break up.
It seems to me that what we're fighting is a massive PR campaign that is centered in two places, Washington and New York. The financial system and the representation, system of representation. In order to fight them, I think that really organizations like the Rutherford Institute, people like you, your organizations, really need to come together in some sort of an umbrella group and launch an equally massive PR campaign in the other direction. Because right now, what I see over and over again is that there's an idea here, and an organization here, a group there, and every now and then something will happen. But you're fighting something that is a massive PR machine, and I don't think it's being done very effectively. So, can you address that?
Well, not in a soundbite. I mean, of course, it's not just a PR machine, right? It's not that the press releases and the materials put out by the war profiteers and the people on that side of things are more timely and better looking and better written and pithier than the press releases coming from the peace groups or the justice groups. It's fundamentally that the owners of the media outlets share the perspective of the people on that side. And so whether you intended this or not, PR campaign doesn't quite encompass what's needed. Of course, what's needed is a completely different communication system from what we have. And we are within a couple of decades, if the current graph continues, going to be down to the very last investigative reporter in the country. Right? I mean, reporters are going out of existence faster than fish in the ocean. And there are countries that invest public dollars in reporting and isolate that money from political influence. There are nations where people invest in communications in effective ways. It could be hoped that the Murdoch's scandal in London, and hopefully making its way over here, might help change the discussion a little bit about the way the rules have been twisted in this country to give these incredible monopolies of our airwaves to this, cartel of international media outlets. But, one way or another, whether it's through changes in the internet or through changes in how television and radio stations can be owned or how newspapers can be produced, we have to find a way to have a decent communication system, which we currently don't. And just getting the little activist groups that don't have any money to unite into different coalitions and so on, is a very, very small part of the solution. The fact is that there isn't any well-funded movement against the military-industrial complex whatsoever. The problem isn't that it isn't united with the other part of it, or it isn't sending out press releases, or it isn't trying hard. The problem is that there isn't any money. Right? I mean, if I had an email if I had a dime for every email that I get complaining about all the money George Soros gives me, I'd be rich. I might meet George Soros. But there isn't any money from him or anybody else. And so somehow we have to change that someday. There was somebody back here.
I wanted to know what your opinion was on why Congress has been so submissive recently regarding the declaration of war, because it seems like the instances of war could be greatly reduced if Congress was forced to declare war every time we initiated hostilities. So why have they given up their prerogative?
Well, this, as I was very unclear with how new wars are, we have to be a little clear about what recently means here. Congress hasn't declared war since 1941, and you know, the reason that that Congress is cowardly is that Congress is designed to be cowardly and always has been, and of course it's getting more so because you have a worsening communication system, because you have an increased flow of money into congressional campaigns through what is essentially a legalized bribery system, because you have an increased dominance of Congress members by two political parties. So you really, when push comes to shove, you have two voices in Congress, not 535. But Congress members would much rather avoid taking positions on anything that's controversial, right? Because you take a position on anything that's controversial, somebody's going to be mad about it, right? So when they can pass the buck and not have to take any position at all, then they can go from room to room and say what pleases each crowd and contradict themselves, but they aren't on record as having, you know, had to take a stand one way or the other. That typically is what politicians of all sorts prefer, you know, with the rare exceptions of people with real integrity. That's what politicians, by the design of the system they're working in, tend to prefer, whether it's on this issue or any other. And so if you can get presidents to have to decide, so much the better for Congress. And so we went from Congress declaring wars to Congress authorizing wars, to Congress authorizing general types of wars if the president sees fit, to, you know, things like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution authorizing sort of a war that then the president decides was an authorization of war, to, you know, all the way in this diminishing trend of congressional participation in the process to Libya, where President Obama outdid everybody and certainly outstripped everybody since the War Powers Resolution was put in place, and very intentionally and explicitly went out of his way to make clear that he was avoiding any participation from Congress whatsoever. And that's just fine with them. I mean, you look at all of the resolutions and amendments they voted on and debated in the past month on Libya. The House has declared it unauthorized, but said go ahead and continue it if you want to. They've, you know, they've declared that they won't fund wars that violate the War Powers Resolution in a separate, you know, in a separate bill for or amendment from where they said that this one doesn't comply with the War Powers Resolution. You know, but when push comes to shove, will they cut off the money? No. Will they cut off the fund that allows this to happen in the future? No. Will they enforce the War Powers Resolution? No. Will they impeach anyone? No. And so, from their perspective, it's much easier that way. The ballot access rules have limited participation. The gerrymandering of the districts incredibly limits participation, and that's happening again this year. It's going to worsen every state in the country. These people do not have competition except from the representative of the other party, who's usually not very far away from where they are, and in most districts now won't be any competition at all. Right? So unless we figure out how to challenge them in between elections, as other countries do, or we challenge people electorally in primaries in an effective way, they don't care because they don't have to care. So on that cheerful note, thank you all for coming and for the good questions.